The Whitlock Vanishing, a 1915 Alaska Triangle mystery. Documentary script. The winter of 1916, a trapper named Jonas Erickson descended into what locals called the Whitlock Cabin, a timber structure 40 miles northeast of Fairbanks, buried in snow so deep that only the peaked roof remained visible above the frozen landscape. What he found inside defied every natural explanation. 7 bodies arranged in a perfect circle around the dinner table. Each member of the Whitlock family frozen in their chairs, their eyes open and staring at the empty center where nothing sat but a simple oil lamp. The lamp was still burning. The food on their plates had not been touched. Outside, their sled dogs were found alive in the kennel, well fed and watered. Inside the cabin, not a single sign of struggle, violence, or distress. Just 7 people who had simultaneously stopped living while the world continued without them. The thermal dynamics alone made no sense. The cabin's interior temperature measured well below freezing, yet the lamp flame persisted, impossibly bright. More disturbing still, when authorities arrived 3 days later to remove the bodies, they discovered something that would haunt Alaska folklore for generations. Carved into the underside of the dinner table, invisible unless you lay beneath it looking up, were 7 names. But they were not the names of the Whitlock family. They were the names of people who would die in the Alaska Triangle over the next 60 years. Wait, before we proceed to the archives. If this enigma has already captured your curiosity, tell us where in the world you're joining this investigation from. To make sure you never miss another hidden truth or forgotten theory, subscribe and join our search. History has not yet revealed all of its secrets. Now, back to the facts. The territory that would become Alaska in 1959 possessed, even in 1915, a reputation for consuming people without explanation. The indigenous Athabascan peoples who had inhabited these lands for millennia understood the relationship between the land and silence, how the wilderness could swallow not just bodies but entire histories, leaving behind only questions that echoed across the tundra like wind through empty valleys. They spoke of places where the veil between worlds grew thin, where time behaved differently, where men who entered in summer emerged in winter, having aged decades in hours. The Whitlock family, recent arrivals from Tennessee's Appalachian mountains, would have heard these warnings. Whether they believed them remains one of the smaller mysteries surrounding their fate. Thomas Whitlock had purchased his homestead claim in the spring of 1913, part of the Great Northern Migration that followed rumors of gold and the promise of federal land grants. He arrived with his wife Margaret, their 4 children, Samuel, aged 14, Rebecca, aged 12, Daniel, aged 9, and young Catherine, aged 6. And Margaret's brother, a man named Josiah Brenner, who served as the family's hunting guide and wilderness expert. The family's letters, preserved in the Fairbanks Historical Archives, paint a portrait of cautious optimism. They were not naive pioneers rushing headlong into danger. Thomas had been a schoolteacher in Tennessee. Margaret had grown up on a mountain farm. Josiah had served as a scout in the Spanish-American War. They were educated, prepared, and methodical in their approach to frontier life. Their cabin stood at the edge of what modern researchers have identified as one of the Alaska Triangle's most active zones. A roughly triangular region between Anchorage, Juneau, and Barrow, where disappearances occur at a rate that defies statistical probability. In 1915, this terminology did not exist. The Triangle would not receive its ominous designation until the 1970s, when journalists began documenting the thousands of people who had vanished without trace in Alaska's wilderness. But the Athabascan elders knew the area by older names. They called it Nulato Nede, the place where souls forget to return. They marked it on their mental maps as territory to be traversed quickly, never settled, certainly never inhabited during the dark months when the sun abandoned the sky for weeks at a time. Thomas Whitlock's letters from the summer of 1915 mention none of this. Instead, they speak enthusiastically of the garden Margaret had planted, of salmon runs so thick you could walk across the river on their backs, of Sam's growing skill with the rifle, of Rebecca's talent for preserving meat and vegetables. The tone is almost aggressively normal, as if the family were determined to impose Tennessee's pastoral rhythms onto Alaska's alien landscape. Only in a letter dated September 23rd, 3 months before the discovery of the bodies, does a note of unease enter Thomas' writing. He describes a phenomenon the locals called the breathing forest. "Last night," Thomas wrote to his brother in Knoxville, "we heard the trees making sounds unlike anything I have encountered in nature. Not wind precisely, though wind was certainly moving through the branches. Something else beneath it, a low resonance, almost vocal, that seemed to come from the earth itself. Margaret insists it was simply the frost acting upon the sap, causing the trunks to contract and produce vibrations. Josiah, however, grew visibly disturbed and spent the night outside our cabin with his rifle. He will not speak of what troubles him, but I have noticed he watches the tree line with an intensity that borders on obsession. The children sense the adult's anxiety and have become subdued. Only young Catherine seems unaffected. She insists the forest is singing good night to us and asked if we might sing back." I discouraged this fancy. The letter was the last communication the Whitlock family would send to the outside world. When Jonas Erickson arrived at their cabin on January 8, 1916, he came at the request of a Fairbanks merchant who had grown concerned. The Whitlocks had failed to collect their monthly supply delivery in December, the first time they had missed the scheduled pickup. Given the brutal winter conditions, missing even one supply run could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Erickson, an experienced trapper who knew the country intimately, agreed to make the journey despite the dangerous cold. The temperature had not risen above -30 Fahrenheit for 2 weeks. The sun, when it appeared at all, skimmed the southern horizon like a dim ember before vanishing again into darkness. Erickson's own account of the discovery, recorded in an affidavit given to Fairbanks Marshal William Sutherland, contains details that would be dissected, analyzed, and disputed for decades. He approached the cabin in mid-afternoon, though afternoon in January meant only a brief twilight, the sky bruised purple and black with cold. The snow had drifted against the cabin walls to a depth of 6 feet, creating the impression that the structure was slowly sinking into the earth. Erickson noted that no smoke came from the chimney. The dogs in their outdoor kennel were barking frantically, a sound that carried across the frozen landscape with unnatural clarity. When he reached the kennel, he found all 5 animals alive, their water trough frozen but recently refilled, their feeding bowls containing what appeared to be fresh meat. The cabin door was not locked. Erickson knocked, received no answer, and entered. The scene that greeted him would be seared into his memory with such intensity that 30 years later, interviewed for a Works Progress Administration oral history project, he could recall every detail without hesitation. The single-room cabin was dark except for the oil lamp on the table. The lamp was burning with a steady, bright flame, impossible given that the cabin's interior was barely warmer than the air outside. Erickson estimated the temperature inside at perhaps 10 or 15 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that his breath emerged in thick clouds, cold enough that the moisture in his nostrils froze instantly. 7 people sat around the rough-hewn table in poses of complete stillness. They were not slumped or collapsed. They sat upright, hands in their laps or resting on the table's edge, heads tilted slightly, as if listening to something just beyond hearing. Their eyes were open. Frost had formed on their eyelashes and in their hair, giving them the appearance of marble statues dusted with diamond powder. On the table before each person sat a plate of food, venison stew by the look of it, with bread and preserved berries. None of the food had been eaten. The spoons lay beside the plates, untouched. Whatever had happened to the Whitlock family had occurred before they had taken their first bite of what would be their last meal. Erickson, despite his years in the wilderness and his exposure to death in various forms, felt his composure fracture. He would later tell Marshall Sutherland that the wrongness of the scene was not merely visual, but visceral, something his body understood before his mind could articulate it. The air inside the cabin felt compressed, he said, as if invisible hands were pressing against his chest. The light from the lamp seemed to bend strangely, creating shadows that moved independent of any physical source. And beneath the silence, for the cabin was absolutely silent, no creak of timber or whisper of wind, he thought he heard something. A sound so low it was almost felt rather than heard. The breathing that Thomas Whitlock had described in his final letter. The trapper forced himself to approach the table. He touched Thomas Whitlock's shoulder, and the body did not move. It was frozen solid, not merely cold, but transformed into something resembling ice. When Erickson attempted to close Thomas's eyes, he found he could not. The eyelids would not move. The eyes themselves were clear, not clouded by death, and seemed to stare through Erickson at something behind him. He turned quickly, rifle raised, but found nothing. Only the cabin wall, the rough timber, and his own shadow cast huge and distorted by the impossible lamp. Erickson retreated from the cabin, gathered his composure, and made a methodical examination of the exterior. The snow around the structure was undisturbed, except by his own tracks and the paths he had observed leading to and from the dog kennel, paths that appeared to have been made recently, within the last day or two. This observation would later become central to the mystery. Someone or something had been caring for the Whitlock dogs. Someone had been entering the cabin and leaving it, walking through snow that recorded every footfall, yet leaving no other sign of their presence. The tracks led from the cabin to the kennel and back, over and over, perhaps a dozen trips. They did not lead anywhere else. They simply appeared at the cabin door and disappeared again, as if the person making them had materialized from nowhere and returned to the same void. More disturbing still, Erickson noticed that the tracks were wrong. The stride was too long, the depth was inconsistent, and though they were clearly human footprints, he could see the impression of boot heels and toes. They were surrounded by something else. Marks in the snow that looked like drag marks or sweep marks, as if whoever made the footprints was being followed by something that moved without walking, something that disturbed the snow surface without leaving definable tracks of its own. The trapper spent that night in his camp half a mile from the Whitlock cabin. He did not sleep. He kept his fire burning bright and his rifle loaded, watching the darkness beyond the firelight with mounting dread. Several times during those long hours, he heard sounds coming from the direction of the cabin. Not human sounds, not animal sounds, something that resembled both and neither. A vocalization that seemed to modulate and pulse like a living thing experimenting with the mechanics of sound production. At one point, he was certain he heard a child's voice calling his name. Impossible, since no one in the Whitlock family could have known his name. The voice called Jonas 3 times, each repetition growing more distorted until the word became unrecognizable. At first light, a grudging gray illumination that barely distinguished earth from sky, Erickson traveled as quickly as conditions allowed to Fairbanks and reported his discovery to Marshall Sutherland. The Marshal, a pragmatic man who had dealt with his share of frontier deaths, was initially inclined to attribute the tragedy to carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty stove or some other environmental factor. Such deaths, while unusual, were not unknown in Alaska's extreme conditions. Families had been found dead before, overcome by fumes or cold or the simple brutal mathematics of frontier survival. But Erickson's account of the burning lamp and the well-tended dogs troubled him. He assembled a party of 4 men, including the territorial doctor Nathan Caldwell, and returned to the Whitlock cabin 2 days after Erickson's initial discovery. What they found confirmed Erickson's testimony, but deepened the mystery immeasurably. The 7 bodies remained in their positions around the table, frozen solid. The lamp continued to burn with its impossible flame. Dr. Caldwell, who would later write a detailed medical report of his findings, was immediately struck by several anomalies. First, the bodies showed no signs of conventional freezing death. When a person dies from hypothermia, the body typically assumes a fetal position as the muscles contract in a final effort to conserve heat. The Whitlock family showed no such positioning. They sat in relaxed postures as if they had simply decided to stop living while remaining perfectly comfortable. Second, the color of the bodies was wrong. Frozen corpses typically display a pale, waxy appearance as blood settles and skin tissues lose moisture. The Whitlocks retained a pink, almost healthy tone to their skin, as if blood still circulated beneath the frozen surface. Dr. Caldwell noted in his report that young Catherine Whitlock appeared to be smiling slightly, an expression that seemed impossible given the circumstances of her death. He attempted to close her eyes, as Erickson had attempted with Thomas, and found the same resistance. The eyes would not close. They continued to stare at the center of the table where the lamp burned. The third anomaly concerned the lamp itself. Marshal Sutherland ordered it extinguished so the bodies could be examined more carefully. 2 men attempted to blow out the flame, but it would not respond. They tried to smother it with a cloth, but the cloth would not catch fire despite being held directly in the flame. Finally, Sutherland himself lifted the lamp and carried it outside into the January cold, thinking the sub-zero temperatures would surely kill the flame. Instead, the lamp burned brighter. In the outdoor air, its light became almost painful to look at, a white phosphorescence that seemed to generate no heat yet hurt the eyes with its intensity. When Sutherland returned the lamp to the table, the flame resumed its normal appearance. Steady, bright, impossible. It was at this point that one of the marshal's party, a carpenter named Ernst Mueller, who had helped build several cabins in the area, noticed something unusual about the table itself. The construction bothered him. The table was too well made, too sophisticated for a frontier cabin, with joinery that suggested professional craftsmanship. Mueller crawled beneath the table to examine the jointwork, and there he made the discovery that would transform the Whitlock mystery from a tragic puzzle into something far darker. Carved into the underside of the table, invisible unless one lay on their back looking up, were 7 names and 7 dates. The carving was fresh. Mueller could see bright wood where the knife had cut, and executed with the careful precision of someone working without haste. The names were Sarah Kellerman, October 1923, Marcus Voss, December 1935, Elizabeth Tate, March 1941, David Cho, August 1952, Patricia Mendoza, January 1964, Robert Sinclair, September 1971, Anna Christensen, February 1978. Marshal Sutherland recorded these names in his report without comment, noting only that they meant nothing to him or anyone in his party. The dates were all in the future, some by only a few years, others by more than 6 decades. The marshal, a practical man dealing with the immediate problem of 7 frozen bodies and a territorial investigation, filed the names as an oddity and moved on to the pressing questions. What had killed the Whitlock family? Who had carved those names? And what in God's name was keeping that lamp burning? Dr. Caldwell attempted to remove the bodies for proper autopsy in Fairbanks, but found he could not. The frozen corpses had somehow bonded to their chairs. When Caldwell tried to lift Thomas Whitlock's body, the chair came with it, and when he tried to separate the body from the chair, he found them fused as if they had been frozen together while still in contact. This phenomenon was inconsistent with normal freezing. Ice forms crystals that expand and separate surfaces. It does not weld organic tissue to wood. Yet here were 7 bodies that could not be removed from their chairs without breaking either the bodies or the furniture. Faced with this impossible situation, Marshall Sutherland made a decision that would be criticized for decades afterward. He ordered the cabin abandoned. The bodies would remain where they were, undisturbed, until spring thaw made proper removal possible. In the meantime, the cabin would be marked as a death site, placed off-limits, and monitored periodically to ensure no disturbance. It was, Sutherland argued, the only reasonable course of action given the extreme cold, the difficulty of the terrain, and the inexplicable nature of the circumstances. To attempt to force the bodies free in sub-zero temperatures risked destroying whatever evidence might explain their deaths. The Marshall's party boarded up the cabin windows, secured the door, and departed. The oil lamp, still burning, was left on the table. Sutherland's final note in his official report contains a sentence that subsequent investigators have parsed endlessly for meaning. The lamp appears to desire to remain lit, and I see no reason to deny it this purpose, whatever that purpose may be. News of the Whitlock deaths spread through Alaska's small population with the speed of all frontier tragedies. The story appeared in the Fairbanks Daily News-Miner on January 15, 1916, under the headline, "Family of 7 Found Dead in Remote Cabin." The article was brief, factual, and made no mention of the burning lamp or the names carved beneath the table. Those details were considered too sensational, too likely to cause panic in a population already struggling with the psychological weight of Alaska's dark winter. But rumors spread regardless, carried by trappers and traders who heard the story from Erickson or from members of Sutherland's party, each retelling adding new details, some factual, some embroidered, until the truth became impossible to extract from the mythology growing around it. The Athabascan peoples, when asked about the Whitlock cabin, would often refuse to discuss it directly. Their reticence was not born of superstition in the European sense, but from a complex understanding of spiritual ecology that defied easy translation. Elder Mary Carr, in an interview conducted in 1967, finally agreed to speak about the incident, though she emphasized that her words were her own interpretation and not representative of all Athabascan beliefs. She explained that the land itself possessed memory and intention. Places where violent or inexplicable events occurred became marked, she said, like scars on skin. These marks attracted certain entities. She used the word entities rather than spirits or ghosts, a careful distinction, that existed in the spaces between human comprehension and natural law. According to Carr, the area where the Whitlock cabin stood had been such a marked place long before Thomas Whitlock purchased his claim. The indigenous peoples had stories going back generations about hunters who entered those woods and returned changed, speaking of lost time, of voices in the trees, of presences that mimicked human form, but moved wrong, spoke wrong, existed wrong. The land there, she said, was hungry in a way that had nothing to do with physical appetite. It consumed certainty. It fed on understanding. People who stayed too long in such places found their grip on reality loosening, their sense of what was possible and impossible beginning to blur. The breathing forest that Thomas Whitlock described in his final letter, Carr suggested, was not metaphor but literal description. The land was attempting to communicate, to establish contact with the humans who had built their dwelling in its marked space. And the Whitlocks, isolated, cut off from indigenous knowledge that might have warned them, had listened. The lamp, Carr believed, was a bridge. Something the Whitlocks had created, or had been compelled to create, that allowed the land's intention to manifest physically. As for the names carved beneath the table, Carr would say only that time in such places did not flow as it did elsewhere, and that past, present, and future could become entangled like threads in a loom. Marshall Sutherland's plan to retrieve the bodies in spring proved impossible to execute. When a party returned to the Whitlock cabin in May 1916, they found the structure collapsed. The snowmelt had undermined the foundation, causing the walls to buckle and the roof to fall inward. The bodies, when recovered from the wreckage, had partially thawed and decomposed, making detailed autopsy impossible. Dr. Caldwell examined what remained and could determine only that he found no obvious signs of trauma, poisoning, or disease. The cause of death for all 7 individuals was listed officially as exposure to extreme cold, a conclusion that satisfied legal requirements but explained nothing. The lamp, remarkably, was recovered intact from the ruins of the cabin, and it was still burning. The flame guttered in the spring wind but did not extinguish. Workers who handled the lamp reported a sensation of warmth that seemed to emanate not from the flame itself, but from somewhere deeper, as if the lamp were merely the visible portion of something much larger extending into dimensions they could not perceive. Marshall Sutherland, disturbed by the lamp's persistence and by the increasingly strange reports from people who encountered it, ordered it placed in an evidence locker in the Fairbanks Territorial Office. It remained there for 3 weeks, burning continuously, before Sutherland finally ordered it destroyed. 3 men attempted to break the lamp using hammers. The glass chimney shattered easily, spraying fragments across the office floor, but the base and the fuel reservoir proved impossible to damage. Hammers bounced off the metal surface without leaving marks. The flame, now exposed to open air without its protective chimney, burned higher and brighter, forcing the men to shield their eyes. Sutherland, his patience exhausted and his pragmatic worldview severely tested, ordered the lamp taken out of Fairbanks and disposed of in the wilderness. A deputy named Charles Waverly received this assignment. He rode 18 miles north, found a deep ravine, and threw the lamp as far as he could into the darkness below. He heard it hit bottom, heard the metal ring against stone. Then he heard nothing. The flame, he assumed, had finally gone out. 6 months later, in October 1916, a prospector named John Timmons was exploring the same ravine, searching for a rumored gold seam. He found, among the rocks at the bottom, an oil lamp. The lamp was burning. Timmons, unaware of its history, was pleased by his find and carried it back to his own cabin. He used it for 3 weeks before strange things began happening. Objects in his cabin would move during the night, rearranging themselves into patterns he did not recognize. His dogs refused to enter the cabin while the lamp was lit. He began to hear voices, speaking words that were almost English but not quite, as if someone were speaking English backward or inside out. Finally, disturbed beyond reason, Timmons hiked back to the ravine and returned the lamp to where he had found it. It remained there, burning in the wilderness, seen occasionally by travelers who would report the strange sight. A lamp, alone in the woods, its flame visible for miles in the Alaska darkness, tended by no one, fed by nothing, burning eternally. The names carved beneath the Whitlock table were copied into Marshall Sutherland's report and filed away, curiosities that seemed to have no immediate relevance to the investigation. But in October 1923, 7 years after the Whitlock deaths, a woman named Sarah Kellerman disappeared while hiking near Denali. Her body was never found. In December 1935, Marcus Voss, a bush pilot, vanished during a routine flight between Anchorage and Nome. No wreckage was ever discovered. In March 1941, Elizabeth Tate, a schoolteacher in Juneau, left her house to walk to the local store and was never seen again. The pattern continued, each name carved beneath the Whitlock table corresponding to a person who would vanish in the Alaska Triangle, always in the month specified, always without trace. By the 1970s, when journalist Jonathan Silverton began investigating the Alaska Triangle phenomenon for a series of articles in the Anchorage Daily News, the Whitlock case had become central to Alaska's folklore. Silverton obtained copies of Marshall Sutherland's original reports and was stunned by the names beneath the table. He began tracking them, confirming that 6 of the 7 people had indeed disappeared in the years and months specified. The 7th name, Anna Christensen, February 1978, had not yet occurred. Silverton published his findings in November 1977, and his article included a specific warning. If the pattern held, a person named Anna Christensen would disappear somewhere in Alaska in February 1978. The article attracted national attention. News organizations picked up the story. The television program In Search Of devoted an episode to the Whitlock mystery. And in Alaska, people named Anna Christensen, there were 17 of them in the state, received worried calls from friends and family. One Anna Christensen, a librarian in Anchorage, gave an interview to the Anchorage Daily News in which she expressed skepticism about the entire affair. "I don't believe in curses or prophecies," she said. "I certainly don't believe that something carved into a table 100 years ago has any bearing on my life." She was 34 years old, healthy, and had no plans to travel in February. On February 19, 1978, Anna Christensen did not arrive at work. Her apartment was found empty. Her car remained in its parking space. Her purse, keys, and wallet were on her kitchen counter. She had simply vanished, as completely as if she had never existed. Police investigation found no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, no leads of any kind. Anna Christensen had become the 7th name, the final confirmation of a prophecy carved by unknown hands in a wilderness cabin in 1915. Dr. Evelyn Marsh, an anthropologist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, became intrigued by the Whitlock case in the early 1980s. She approached it not from a supernatural perspective, but from the angle of psychological anthropology and environmental psychology. Her hypothesis, the Whitlock family had experienced a shared psychotic episode triggered by isolation, extreme darkness, possible carbon monoxide exposure, and cultural dislocation. The names carved beneath the table, she argued, were random names the family had encountered, people they had met, heard of, or imagined. And the subsequent disappearances were coincidence given the high rate of missing persons in Alaska generally. Marsh's theory was thorough, well-researched, and utterly failed to account for several key facts. First, the names beneath the table included people who were children or not yet born in 1915, making it impossible for the Whitlocks to have encountered them. Marcus Voss, for instance, was born in 1918. Anna Christensen was born in 1944. Second, the specific months of the disappearances matched the carved dates with impossible precision. Third, Marsh's carbon monoxide hypothesis could not explain the burning lamp, the bonding of the bodies to their chairs, or the strange tracks in the snow around the cabin. When these points were raised during a symposium at which Marsh presented her findings, she acknowledged the difficulties but maintained that a rational explanation must exist even if it remained elusive. In 1985, a team of paranormal investigators calling themselves the Alaska Anomaly Research Group received permission from the Fairbanks Historical Society to excavate the site where the Whitlock cabin had stood. The wooden structure itself had long since rotted away, but the foundation stones remained, and the team hoped to find physical evidence that might support or refute various theories. What they found instead was deeply unsettling. The ground beneath where the cabin had stood was abnormally warm. Even in October, with the first snows already falling, soil temperatures at the site measured 15 to 20 degrees warmer than surrounding areas. Magnetometer readings showed wild fluctuations, with magnetic field strength varying dramatically across the site in patterns that made no geological sense. Most disturbing, when the team set up audio recording equipment and left it running overnight, the recordings captured sounds that defied explanation. Long, low tones that resembled the breathing Thomas Whitlock had described. vocalizations that seemed to be attempts at human speech but were distorted beyond comprehension. And at 3:47 a.m., clearly audible on the tape, a child's voice saying, "The lamp is still burning." The team's leader, a former geology professor named Raymond Kowalski, admitted in his final report that the investigation had raised more questions than it answered. He recommended that the site be studied using more sophisticated equipment and that experts from multiple disciplines be brought in to collaborate on understanding what, if anything, made this location unique. His recommendations were never implemented. Funding for such research was non-existent, and most mainstream scientists refused to take the case seriously. The Alaska Anomaly Research Group disbanded in 1987 after internal disagreements about methodology and interpretation. But the story of the Whitlock family refused to die. It circulated through Alaska as a cautionary tale, a reminder that the state contained mysteries that predated human understanding. Tourists began seeking out the Whitlock site, though it was remote and difficult to access. A rough trail developed, marked by those who had made the pilgrimage before. And people who visited the site reported strange experiences. Time distortions, where what felt like an hour turned out to be 3 or 4. Audio hallucinations of voices speaking in the trees, and most commonly, the sensation of being watched by something that remained just out of sight. In 1992, a Fairbanks resident named Michael Torres became obsessed with finding the lamp that had burned in the Whitlock cabin. He had read everything written about the case and believed the lamp was the key to understanding what had happened. Torres spent 3 summers hiking through the wilderness north of Fairbanks, searching ravines and caves for the lamp that Deputy Charles Waverly had thrown away in 1916. In his journals, Torres documented increasingly bizarre experiences. He claimed the forest itself was guiding him, showing him paths that appeared overnight and vanished by morning. He wrote of hearing singing that seemed to come from beneath the earth. He described finding clearings where all the trees had grown in spiral patterns, their trunks twisted as if subjected to tremendous rotational force. On September 14, 1992, Torres wrote his final journal entry. "I've found it. The lamp is burning in a place where it shouldn't exist, a cave that opens only when you're not looking directly at it. I'm going inside. If I don't return, tell them the Whitlocks were trying to warn us, not predict. The names aren't prophecy. They're a list of who the land will choose next, and I think I just put my name on that list." Michael Torres never returned from his hike. Search parties found his campsite, his supplies, and his journal, but no trace of Torres himself. The area he described, a cave that opened only when not directly observed, was never found, though searchers spent weeks combing the region. Torres became another name on the long list of people who vanished in the Alaska Triangle, another mystery in a landscape that seemed to specialize in collecting the unexplained. Dr. Sarah Chen, a physicist specializing in quantum mechanics and spatial anomalies, encountered the Whitlock case in 2003 while researching unusual electromagnetic phenomena in Alaska. Chen was initially skeptical of the supernatural interpretations, but became interested when she analyzed the magnetometer data collected by the Alaska Anomaly Research Group. The fluctuations recorded at the Whitlock site displayed patterns consistent with what physicists call quantum decoherence, the breakdown of quantum superposition states when a system interacts with its environment. In layman's terms, the Whitlock site seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously, and observation was causing those states to collapse into one or another configuration. Chen proposed a radical theory. The Alaska Triangle contained regions where the normal rules of spacetime became flexible due to unknown geological or cosmological factors. In these regions, events that were probabilistic, things that might happen, could become entangled with events that had already happened or were currently happening. The Whitlock family, Chen suggested, had not predicted the future by carving those names. Instead, they had accessed a probability map, a quantum web that connected their deaths to other deaths across decades, all of them occurring in locations where space-time had become unstable. The burning lamp, in Chen's interpretation, was a manifestation of persistent quantum coherence, a system that refused to collapse into a classical state, maintaining its superposition indefinitely. The lamp existed simultaneously as both burning and not burning, present and absent, real and imaginary, and human observation could not force it to choose one state. This would explain why the lamp could not be extinguished or destroyed. Attempts to interact with it simply shift between states without ever fully resolving into a single classical configuration. Chen's theory was published in a fringe physics journal and ignored by the mainstream scientific community. Quantum mechanics on a macro-scale lamps and cabins and human bodies violated too many established principles. Physics did not work that way. Reality did not work that way. Yet Chen pointed out that reality in the Alaska Triangle demonstrably did work in ways that violated established principles. Thousands of disappearances, malfunctioning instruments, time distortions. The Alaska Triangle was less a geographical location than a laboratory where the universe's normal rules were suspended, and humans who entered it became unwitting participants in experiments they could neither understand nor survive. In 2011, a documentary filmmaker named Robert Ashford received a tip from an anonymous source who claimed to have information about the Whitlock case. Ashford, who had produced several well-regarded documentaries about unsolved mysteries, agreed to meet the source in Fairbanks. The source turned out to be an elderly Athabascan woman named Grace Petrov, the granddaughter of Elder Mary Carr, who had spoken about the case in 1967. Petrov was 93 years old and, she told Ashford, wanted to share information that her grandmother had asked her to keep secret until the time was right. According to Petrov, her grandmother had visited the Whitlock cabin in the winter of 1915, before the family died. Mary Carr had been traveling through the area with her father and had stopped at the cabin to trade. The Whitlocks had been gracious hosts, but Carr had immediately sensed something wrong. The cabin, she said, smelled like copper and ozone, like the air before a lightning strike. The children had been subdued, moving slowly, speaking in whispers. And Thomas Whitlock had shown her something he had been working on, an oil lamp he was modifying, adding mirrors and lenses in configurations he claimed would maximize the light output for minimum fuel consumption. Carr had warned Thomas that he was interfering with something he did not understand. The land, she explained through her father, who served as translator, did not appreciate modifications. Tools in Alaska had to be simple, direct, unchanged from their original purpose. To alter a tool, to make it more than it was, risked creating a bridge that other things could cross. Thomas had laughed politely and thanked her for the warning, but continued his work. Carr and her father had left, and Carr had told her family that the Whitlocks would not survive the winter. But here was the detail that Petrov said her grandmother had kept secret. Mary Carr had seen the names beneath the table. She had looked, though she had not known why, and had seen them carved there, fresh and bright. Thomas Whitlock had not carved those names. No one in the family had carved them. The names had appeared on their own, etched into the wood by something that wanted to communicate, something that wanted humans to know it was aware of time in ways humans were not. The lamp was not just a bridge, Carr had believed. It was a beacon, and the Whitlocks had lit it. Ashford included this information in his documentary, which aired on a cable network in 2012. The documentary presented multiple theories, psychological, environmental, scientific, supernatural, without endorsing any single explanation. But it introduced millions of viewers to the Whitlock case and reignited public interest in the Alaska Triangle. Online forums devoted to unexplained phenomena exploded with theories about what had really happened to the Whitlock family. People debated quantum mechanics and shamanistic traditions and government conspiracies and extraterrestrial contact. The case became a Rorschach test onto which investigators projected their pre-existing beliefs about the nature of reality. In 2015, exactly 100 years after the Whitlock family moved to Alaska, a group of researchers from the Institute for Anomalous Studies petitioned the Alaska state government for permission to conduct a comprehensive investigation of the Whitlock site. The petition included plans for ground-penetrating radar surveys, atmospheric sampling, long-term environmental monitoring, and the establishment of a permanent research station. The state government, after considerable internal debate, denied the petition. The official reason given was environmental protection. The area was home to sensitive wildlife habitats that could not be disturbed. But leaked emails suggested the real reason was concern about attracting publicity that might encourage amateur investigators and thrill seekers to flood the area, creating safety and liability issues. The Whitlock site remains officially off-limits. Signs posted at the trailhead warn visitors that the area is closed to public access. But enforcement is sporadic, and people continue to make the journey. Some are researchers, some are curious tourists, some are seekers hoping to experience whatever presence or phenomenon manifests in that strange clearing 40 miles northeast of Fairbanks. And, according to rangers who patrol the area, people continue to report unusual experiences. Lights in the forest where no lights should be, voices calling their names, the sensation of time moving incorrectly, and most persistently, the sight of a burning lamp visible for just a moment between trees before vanishing when directly observed. In 2019, an environmental scientist named Dr. James Whitmore conducted an unauthorized soil sampling expedition to the Whitlock site. Whitmore was interested not in supernatural explanations, but in potential geological factors that might cause hallucinations or psychological distress. His hypothesis centered on radon gas, naturally occurring radioactive gas that can seep from soil and accumulate in enclosed spaces, causing a variety of health effects, including, in extreme cases, hallucinations and cognitive impairment. If the Whitlock cabin had been built over a radon source, the family might have been slowly poisoned, leading to the strange behaviors and ultimately their deaths. Whitmore's soil samples showed elevated radon levels at the site, higher than surrounding areas, but not high enough to cause acute poisoning. More interesting was the presence of unusual mineral deposits, compounds containing rare earth elements in configurations that Whitmore could not explain. The deposits seemed to be concentrated in a circular pattern roughly 30 feet in diameter, with the Whitlock cabin foundation at the center. These minerals, Whitmore speculated, might have unusual electromagnetic properties that could affect human neurology or perhaps even local space-time geometry, lending some credence to Dr. Chen's quantum theory. But Whitmore's most startling finding came from his nighttime observations. He had set up monitoring equipment and planned to stay at the site for 3 days. On his second night, at approximately 3:45 a.m., his magnetometer readings spiked dramatically. At the same moment, he saw what he described as a column of faint light appearing at the center of the old cabin foundation. The light was barely visible, a ghostly phosphorescence that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. Whitmore approached with a Geiger counter and found the column was emitting low levels of radiation, not dangerous but definitely present. He estimated the column was roughly 3 feet in diameter and extended upward to a height of about 5 feet before fading into invisibility. The column persisted for 17 minutes, then vanished. Whitmore's audio recordings from that period captured sounds consistent with other researchers' reports. Low-frequency vibrations, possible vocalizations, and at one point what might have been words, though so distorted that transcription was impossible. Whitmore left the site the following morning, disturbed by his experience and uncertain how to interpret his findings. His published paper, Anomalous Electromagnetic and Radiological Phenomena at the Whitlock Site, Alaska, was largely ignored by the scientific community, but became a key reference document for investigators who believed the Whitlock mystery had a physical rather than supernatural basis. The question of what happened to the Whitlock family remains, even now, a century after their deaths, unresolved. The physical evidence supports multiple interpretations. The rational explanations, carbon monoxide poisoning, mass psychogenic illness, environmental toxins, cannot account for all the observed phenomena. The supernatural explanations, spiritual attack, dimensional intrusion, temporal anomaly, cannot be tested or falsified. And the scientific explanations, while compelling, require accepting premises about quantum mechanics and space-time that push the boundaries of established physics. What is known with certainty is this: 7 people died under circumstances that defied explanation. Their deaths were connected, through means unknown, to 7 other disappearances spanning 6 decades. The location where they died continues to display unusual properties that resist conventional analysis. And somewhere in the Alaska wilderness, if the stories can be believed, an oil lamp continues to burn, tended by no one, fueled by nothing, marking a spot where the membrane between possible and impossible has worn dangerously thin. The Alaska Triangle contains approximately 200,000 square miles of territory. Within that territory, more than 20,000 people have disappeared since Alaska became a state in 1959. Most of these disappearances have conventional explanations: people underestimating the harshness of the environment, accidents, animal attacks, simple misfortune. But a percentage of cases resist explanation. People vanish from locations that should not allow disappearance. They leave impossible evidence or no evidence at all. They are there one moment and gone the next, as if erased from reality by an editor's pen. The Whitlock case stands at the center of this mystery not because it is unique, but because it is documented. We have names, dates, official reports. We have the testimony of witnesses who could not be easily dismissed as unreliable. We have a chain of evidence that, while circumstantial and often strange, creates a narrative that cannot be ignored simply because it makes us uncomfortable. The Whitlock family died. How they died, and why, and what their deaths meant in the larger context of the Alaska Triangle phenomenon remains the essential question. In the indigenous traditions that predate European contact, the land itself is not passive. It thinks, it wants, it remembers. This worldview, dismissed by European settlers as primitive superstition, may contain insights that Western science is only beginning to acknowledge. The Earth is not merely a ball of rock and water. It is a complex system exhibiting behaviors that resemble, at least metaphorically, consciousness. The Alaska Triangle, in this context, might be understood as a region where the land's consciousness is more active, more aware, more willing to interact with, and sometimes consume the humans who venture into it. Thomas Whitlock, in his final letter, described the forest as singing. He used that word, singing, not as poetry, but as description. What if he was correct? What if the sounds he heard were the land's attempts to communicate, to establish contact with creatures whose minds worked differently from its own vast, slow awareness? The Whitlocks listened, they heard, and in hearing, they became entangled with something they could not hope to understand, something that existed on timescales and in dimensions beyond human perception. The lamp they created, or the lamp that created itself through their hands, might have been the result of this entanglement, a physical object that embodied the translation between human and other, between time as we experience it and time as it actually exists. The lamp burned because burning was the closest human concept to what it was actually doing, and the names beneath the table were not predictions but observations. The land, whatever consciousness or force animates it, looking forward and backward simultaneously, seeing the pattern of deaths that would mark its territory over the next 60 years and recording them as a statement, "I know, I see, I am aware." This interpretation satisfies no one. It is too mystical for scientists, too mechanistic for believers in the supernatural, too terrifying for those who prefer their mysteries to remain safely in the past. But it accounts for the facts as we know them. It explains why the lamp could not be destroyed. It explains the names and the dates. It explains why the site continues to display unusual properties. And it suggests that what happened to the Whitlock family was not unique but exemplary, a particularly well-documented instance of something that has happened many times before and will happen many times again, in the Alaska Triangle and perhaps in other places where the Earth's awareness pierces through the surface and manifests in ways that human consciousness interprets as malevolent or inexplicable. In 2024, a linguistics professor named Dr. Helena Vance published a paper analyzing the audio recordings made at the Whitlock site by various researchers over the years. Vance's specialty was non-human communication systems, how whales, elephants, and other intelligent species encode information in sound. She approached the Whitlock recordings not as human speech or random noise, but as potentially structured communication from a non-human intelligence. What she found was stunning. The audio contained patterns, repeating structures, modulations that resembled syntax. The sounds were not language in any human sense, but they were not random. Something was speaking. Something was encoding information. And that something had been speaking at the Whitlock site for at least a century. Vance's paper sparked fierce debate. Linguists argued her methodology was flawed, but acoustical engineers who examined her work found her technical analysis sound. The patterns were there. Whether they constituted communication was interpretive, but their existence was not. Something at the Whitlock site was producing structured sound. And if the recordings from 1985, 1992, and 2019 were compared, the structures were evolving. The patterns were growing more complex. The entity or phenomenon or force that produced them was, perhaps, learning, becoming more sophisticated in its attempts to bridge the gap between its existence and human understanding. This possibility may be the most unsettling aspect of the entire Whitlock mystery. If Vance is correct, the Alaska Triangle is not simply a place where strange things happen. It is a place where something is actively trying to communicate with humanity. The deaths and disappearances are not random tragedies, but attempts at contact by an intelligence so alien that the attempt itself is fatal to most humans. The Whitlock family was not killed, they were recruited. They became part of whatever process or consciousness animates that land. And their final act, carving the names, creating the lamp, arranging themselves around the table, was their attempt to leave a message for those who would come after. The message, if message it is, remains undeciphered. We have the names of 7 people who vanished. We have a lamp that burns eternally. We have audio recordings of sounds that might be words in a language no human throat can speak. We have soil samples showing unusual mineral deposits. We have witness testimony spanning more than a century. We have electromagnetic anomalies and time distortions and disappearances without explanation. And we have 7 bodies arranged in a circle, staring at nothing, their eyes open, their expressions peaceful, as if death had been not an ending, but a transition into something else, something for which we have no name and no category. The Alaska Triangle continues to claim lives. People continue to vanish. And at a certain clearing 40 miles northeast of Fairbanks, where the Whitlock cabin once stood, the land continues to sing in frequencies below human hearing, continues to reach out across the barrier between what we think reality is and what reality might actually be. The Whitlocks were the first to listen carefully enough to hear. Whether they were the last depends on who else has the courage or the folly to stand in that place after darkness falls and wait to hear their names spoken by the breathing forest. On winter nights, when the aurora dances across Alaska's sky and curtains of green and purple fire, some people claim they can see, if they know where to look, a small point of light shining in the wilderness north of Fairbanks. The light does not move. It does not waver. It burns with perfect constancy through blizzard and clear sky alike. Local pilots avoid flying over the area. The Athabascan peoples continue to give it a wide berth, teaching their children that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, some questions not meant to be asked, some doors not meant to open. The official records state that Thomas, Margaret, Samuel, Rebecca, Daniel, Catherine Whitlock, and Josiah Brenner died of exposure on or about January 5, 1916. Their bodies are buried in the Fairbanks Municipal Cemetery under a single stone that reads simply, "The Whitlock family, gone but not forgotten." Tourists sometimes visit the grave, leaving small tokens, coins, flowers, notes, as if the dead might somehow receive these offerings and be comforted. But the grave contains only bones. Whatever the Whitlocks became, whatever transition they underwent in that frozen cabin while the lamp burned and the forest sang, it left their bodies behind as discarded shells, evidence of a journey whose destination remains unknown. In the end, perhaps that is the true legacy of the Whitlock mystery. Not a solution, but a question that refuses to resolve. Not an answer, but a reminder that the world contains depths we have not plumbed, dimensions we have not mapped, consciousnesses we have not contacted. The Alaska Triangle is vast. The universe is vaster. And somewhere between what we know and what we fear, in the space where certainty breaks down and possibility bleeds through, the Whitlock family sits forever at their table, waiting for us to understand what they tried to tell us, waiting for the lamp to finally go out, waiting for someone to speak the language of the breathing forest and translate its song into words that human minds can hold without breaking. The lamp is still burning, the forest is still singing, and the land continues to remember in ways that our brief lives and fragile understanding can barely comprehend, that we are not alone in our awareness, not singular in our consciousness, not safe in our assumptions about what reality permits or forbids. The Whitlocks learned this truth. 7 others learned it in the years that followed, and in the Alaska Triangle, where time moves strangely and space folds back upon itself, countless others may yet learn it still, adding their names to a list that began beneath a rough-hewn table in a frozen cabin and extends forward into a future no one can predict and no one can escape.